The ultimate class picking guide for season 2. I'm gonna watch this and give you guys my commentary on if I actually think the class is good or not. Let's see if I agree with them.
Not only are we getting a brand new map that actually looks fun to play, but there are massive changes to classes and crowd control that will completely change the meta. And of course, we're going to have a brand new mount, perfect for picking up the ladies.
There's extra room in this mount, please.
Which has still not worked for me. Yet. Wouldn't it be nice if those dating apps actually guaranteed you got matches? I guess I gotta get in shape first, but the gym is always crowded and doesn't guarantee fast results either. Luckily, us WoW players got something better than chicks and
Oh my god.
biceps. Gladiator titles, baby! Skillcap.com is the only place that guarantees you can gain at least 4. Start with Death Knight, who's had a weird trajectory.
All right, yeah, that was, check out Skillcap, guys, it's great. All right, next, we're gonna go to DK.
So far this expansion. Unholy started the expansion strong as one of the best specs in PvP, but was eventually surpassed by Frost as the better overall spec. Unholy is still fundamentally a pet class with a bunch of disjointed cooldowns who does best when everyone on the enemy team is stacked on the same pixel. The patch will be changing its damage profile quite a bit, shifting more damage into pets and death coils and away from dots. On paper, this should make it easier to deal damage when uptime is limited, which has been a big problem for melee in general this expansion. Unfortunately, these damage buffs are coming with a few passive defensive nerfs, and if there's one thing you should know about playing Death Knight in general, it's the fact that you will be the kill target more often than not. Despite its reputation as the caster bully, DKs are often bullied themselves. Frost is where things get interesting. We've said in the past that Frost DK is just a gimmick, but these days it actually has two distinct specs. Two-handed build centered around all-in burst, and a one-handed build for better single-target damage.
I kind of feel like the changes for Frost Death Knight are either going to make it, like, insanely good or trash. Like, I don't think there's going to be any in between. Basically, it has, like, a new gimmick where you AoE the entire screen with your whatever it's called, Remorseless Winter. You move 1 pixel an hour, and you have a giant Remorseless Winter that does 1,000% more damage. But you lose your stun, so you're no longer going to have that Remorseless Winter stun. So it's like, if people can somehow get away from you during that, you're not going to be able to kill anything, but if they can't, you're just going to be so disgusting.
Ironically, the whole gimmick of Frost DK might be even getting more extreme thanks to a new PvP talent that turns Pillar of Frost into a, well, scarier Pillar of Frost.
Like, look at how slow you are.
Overall, we don't expect the playstyle of Frost DK to change that much at all. It's still going to center around doing massive goes every minute or so, aiming to tunnel down one target while cleaving the butts off of everyone else nearby. DK will continue to be split down the center, with Unholy representing more of that classic brawler melee, while Frost is somewhat of a tactician, aiming to set up kills in more organized goes. Next up is Demon Hunter, who've been a bit under the radar so far this expansion.
All right.
DH is getting some pretty notable...
Oh, we got MVQ in here. I told Moran the info for that section, so curious. Here we go, baby.
Changes in the new season, which on paper should help it sustain damage while making the spec less reliant on metamorphosis. In case you've been out of the loop, Demon Hunters typically play the Fell-Scarred Hero spec, which shoves a lot of power into meta windows. Right now, in Solo Shuffle, Demon Hunters are incredibly reliant on their 2-minute cooldown in order to finish out games, which isn't exactly ideal as a melee, which tends to be a bit fragile in some lobbies. 11.1 is reintroducing a previously overpowered tier set bonus as a talent onto the Havoc tree. Screaming Brutality causes Blade Dance to automatically proc Throw Glaive, which has a few cascading effects built in. For Demon,
they're gonna get their auto snare basically, which is gonna be big. So now when they're actually bringing this back. Like you said, this is a repeat set bonus, but essentially when you use your Blade Dance, you're gonna throw out glaives and you're gonna have an auto snare now.
Hunters, this is a massive quality of life improvement. DH is also getting a rework to their Cycle of Hatred talent, which will make it possible to reduce the cooldown of I-Beam down to 20 seconds fairly quickly, which means having more frequent micro burst windows. Altogether, this means that Demon Hunter will now have much better sustained damage overall, which might wind up being a very good thing in Solo Shuffle, where they're currently too reliant on their 2-minute burst windows. We should also note that DH is getting a new PvP talent, Illidan's Grasp, which is some Darth Vader type mechanic that lifts players off the ground and allows them to be tossed across the map. We doubt that this will see much play in Arena, but it will definitely be a Twitch.
Dude, this is so bullshit, by the way, in Battleground Blitz. Like, I don't think you guys understand how stupid this is. Demon Hunters are literally just going to be able to throw you off a cliff. It's so dumb. Like, look.
Clip generator in BG Blitz. Moving on, what's the state of Druids in Season 2? First, the bad news. Cyclone is getting its first major nerf in years, losing 1 second of its overall duration. But not to worry, since there are some pretty big defensive
What's the CD? I think it's like 30 or 40 seconds, something like that.
buffs for the class overall, thanks to a redesign to the Druid talent tree, which makes it easier to pick up more defensive and utility options. Balanced Druids aren't getting many specific changes in the patch, which means they will be retaining their identity as a pace setter in Arena. This includes controlling tempo with Cyclones and then periodically bursting with Star Surge, which is even buffed with the patch. While there have been attempts to experiment with AoE-centered Starfall builds, most balanced Druids have stuck with their guns as classic single-target cannons. The main skill check for playing Boomkin will be how well you can manage pressure. There's a high chance you will be the kill target every game, and you need to know when it's safe to Cyclone or when it's time to shift into bear form to tank some damage. But with the defensive buffs coming, balanced Druid will be in a slightly better position. Feral Druid is looking really strong too, and is also getting virtually zero spec changes. These days, Feral is a jack of all trades. It performs multiple roles in Arena all at once. Your damage is evenly split up into dot damage and burst, and can be min-maxed by abusing different damage modifiers. You're rewarded for having high uptime on bleeds and paying attention to procs in order to funnel damage into Ferocious Bite. And while you're doing this, you have the ability to completely shut down the enemy team. Feral Druids are typically good partners for any caster since they can perform the same roles as a rogue in many ways. But just like Boomkin, a big skill check with Feral is knowing when it's safe to Cyclone or when you need to kite in bear form. In order to be good at Feral, you need to do a lot more than W key in and press damage.
That was nice.
This spec has a pretty high learning curve, which won't be changing in the patch. What about Restoration? Well, this is the only Druid spec to see significant changes. First,
I'm really curious to see how this goes. I don't think he's mentioned it yet, but Cyclone getting nerf. Maybe he did mention it. Cyclone's getting a 1 second nerf, so it's finally going to go down to 5 seconds, which will be interesting. Okay, he did mention it. It's the first thing he said. Okay, so he did mention it. Yeah, 5 seconds is going to be interesting. I really, this new PvP talent for Resto Druids, where you basically turn into a massive Trent that you can't be CC'd for, I think is going to be really interesting. The other thing I'm really worried about for Resto Druids is the fact that they're losing their Tranquility immunity. Like, when I play Druid, there's so many games I would just be insta-dead. Like, it's basically, they do a setup on you, you trinket, they do a setup on you, you barely survive, and then get the trank immunity off, you know? I'm actually so afraid for them not having that.
First things first, what isn't changing is the fact that hot maintenance will still be very important for the spec. That's not changing at all. You're still going to be rewarded for keeping up hots and extending them with Cenarian Ward. Now though, hot maintenance will be a bit more forgiving thanks to a redesign to their mastery, which will now be slightly stronger when there are fewer hots on the target, and the fact that Life Bloom no longer stacks to 3. Don't worry though, because there are other healing buffs to compensate. Resto Druids are also getting 2 brand new PvP talents, with one replacing Tree Form.
Dude, this looks so goofy. I'm not gonna lie, this looks so goofy. Like,
which should make it easier to heal burst damage more frequently. They're also getting another brand new PvP talent that rewards offensive plays. Druids will be able to extend their hots by casting damage or using Cyclone, and will even be able to buff their healing with Star Surge. Pretty neat. Overall, we expect Resto Druid to be slightly easier and more forgiving, and might even have more offensive potential thanks to some key damage buffs. Now let's look at Evoker, starting with Augmentation. This spec has gone through some pretty radical changes since its debut in Dragonflight Season 2. While it still has plenty of utility options, it's shifted away from being a true support class into more of a standalone DPS. 11.1 doubles down on this with a change to Ebon Might, which will no longer affect healers. In general, we aren't expecting much from Augmentation this season. Instead, we think
it might be interesting. So I think what they did for Augmentation is they made it so your Ebon Might doesn't work on healers, but it's better with the DPS. So I think they're bringing it back to like buff the other damage dealer on your team, but it doesn't work on healers anymore. So I think there might be some synergy there with some classes.
Devastation will continue to be the more popular spec. Dev has seen a few improvements over the past few seasons.
What are your thoughts on the Cabal? I don't even know what the Cabal is. What's the Cabal? Can you explain it to me?
Making it less of a slot machine spec, with better consistent damage coming out of Disintegrate. And these days, Devastation is just a straight up bully against melee DPS, with tons of mobility thanks to the Scale Commander hero tree. With that said, 11.1 is reworking the Flame Shaper hero spec, which has only seen play in niche situations so far this expansion. This spec is optimized for those classic blender situations.
It's a fake thing that was created by people that don't have Qs. The Cabal effed over meta. The Cabal is a cult. The Cabal is actually real in Battleground Blitz, by the way. Like, I don't know about arenas. I've heard some stuff about arenas, but I can confirm, like, I've seen it with my own eyes, that in Blitz it's real.
An arena where everyone on the enemy team is grouped up on the same pixel. Until this point, it's only seen play in comps with Frost DK since it enables even more AoE burst. Anyway, what this all means is that next season, Dev Evokers will have two very desirable paths to take. If they want to continue doing great sustained damage with high mobility, then Scale Commander will be the move. But if they want to do insane bursts like the early days, then Flame Shaper is the play.
I'm actually really curious about Flame Shaper. I feel like it has kind of an interesting playstyle, and nobody played it. Literally most dead hero talent I think I've ever seen. Flame Shaper was completely dead garbage. So I'm curious if it ends up being good, because I think it could be pretty fun.
As far as preservation is concerned, this spec really isn't seeing that many changes compared to other healers. But what does that mean? Well, it's pretty clear at this point that Prez has become the premier offensive healer in WoW Arena, which will still be true next patch. By design, Prez wants nothing more than for everyone in the arena to be clumped up together, which not only makes it easier to heal, but to deal damage too. It's really the only healer in the game.
The Cabal is an idea that the highest of high players network specific people to get rank 1 by playing alts, preventing people from getting queues and gatekeeping rating. I think that that's definitely real. I think that's 100% real. I think that that's real. I don't think that that's fake.
A game that wants its team to take a lot of AoE damage. This makes it great in those classic melee cleave blender situations, or when playing very aggressive comps like Boomy Rogue. We will warn you that Preservation will continue to be one of the hardest healers in the game for beginners, unless you're already a healer main.
5 out of 9 warriors this season played with Saul to rank 1. I believe it.
You might find its playstyle incredibly backwards. It's kind of like playing two different healers at once. You have to be proactive with your hots like a Resto Druid, while also being proactive and offensive like a Resto Shaman. If there is one spec that is already easy and will still be good for beginners next patch, it's definitely BM Hunter, which could wind up being insanely oppressive. Beast Mastery is still going to be the spec known for summoning a bunch of nameplates, but is actually seeing some pretty big changes, including the complete removal of Basilisk Collar, which was a talent that turned the spec into...
I'm so excited for BM Hunter. You know, BM Hunters, or Hunters in general, are one of the only classes I didn't get Elite on. So that's going to be a Season 2 goal, being an Elite Hunter.
A sort of single target dot class of all things. BM Hunters will also be able to play with one pet instead of two, which will also buff its damage and size. And speaking of pets, the pack leader hero tree is getting a massive rework. With
I'm excited to play Marks Hunter.
That periodically summons all 3 of Rexar's pets one by one. There will be a Wyvern that offers a stacking damage buff, a boar that rushes across the map and hits
Yo, Shreehorp, thanks for the sub,
and
man.
finally, a bear that simply jumps to the target to cleave, which you might already guess will be doing big dam in solo shuffle. We could definitely see Pack Leader being super broken, since virtually every single talent on the tree is focused on buffing pet damage. The only downside is that its defensive talent flat out sucks compared to what is offered by Dark Ranger. Anyway, the TLDR is that BM Hunters might be doing even bigger damage next season.
Oh, thank God. I mean, that's exactly what I wanted.
With even more NPCs on your screen. Marks is getting a major overhaul across the board and could also...
I think Marks is going to be sick. I really do.
True Clothy Slayer. Anyway, as we mentioned in our patch preview video, Marks is a completely new pet. And God bless America, because it's a bald eagle. This spotting eagle will handle all of your standard pet duties, but will be untargetable and will sometimes...
Here's a fun little fact that a lot of people don't know. That noise that America likes to pretend bald eagles make, that's not actually an eagle, by the way. That like screeching noise isn't an eagle. That might be very hard to believe, but it's actually a hawk. It's not an eagle. Eagles don't sound that cool. Do you guys know that? That's a fun little factoid.
Sometimes even donate a big damage multiplier for aimed shot, which now has a built-in MS effect. Anyway, the entire Marks Hunter tree is getting reworked, including a complete redesign to True Shot, which now beefs up crit damage, and this...
Yeah, we knew that. A lot of people don't know that, by the way. How many of you guys didn't know that? I bet there's people in here that didn't know that.
This is why we think that Marks could be pretty dangerous, because its classic one-shots might be back on the menu. The only thing that could hold Marks Hunters back are, of course, rogues and feral druids, since getting off those aim shots is much harder with a bunch of stuns and disarms standing in the way. Survival is looking pretty interesting next season too. The melee ranged hybrid is becoming slightly more melee based thanks to massive buffs to Mongoose Bite. This will come at the loss of Butchery, but overall survival should be doing more damage and especially more burst. The Sentinel hero tree is also getting a mini rework that will buff survival and marks. Lunar Storm will now have a much larger radius and will even follow players around, making it much easier to do damage. Hunters are seeing some other changes across the board too, including a new PvP talent called Explosive Powder that adds a disengage effect to explosive shots.
That's kind of cool.
Flare is also getting a buff to its radius, and will basically cover half of the arena, which means good luck to all you rogues and druids out there.
Yeah, good luck, baby.
Now let's move on to our mage spec, starting with Arcane. If you haven't played in a while, Arcane is like playing Wii bowling while running full speed on a treadmill. It's the mage spec.
Oh, my favorite spec, Arcane. Let's go.
Designed to run around the edge of the map all game, waiting for the perfect moment to line up Evocation, Arcane Surge, Touch of the Magi, and a few different Arcane Missiles procs, all while trying to bowl down enemies with Orb to avoid ever needing to hard cast. Still a bit complicated and weird to say the least. Although it seems like Arcane is getting a lot of changes, the fundamental playstyle will still be the same. Fire is getting some fairly moderate changes to its damage profile, with Blizzard shifting damage away from Fire Blast and Phoenix Flames toward Pyroblast. It's hard to say how this will pan out for the spec in PvP.
Fire, here's the one thing about Fire. It has a very OP set bonus. You know what's really weird about Fire? Its set bonus is always just you do more damage with Combust. I'm telling you, Fire Mage's set bonus, 9 times out of 10 is just your Combust does something to do more damage. Your Combust gives you more int. Your Combust gives you more... Your Combust gives you more crit damage. Your Combust, you know, makes your crits hit 5% harder. It's always just some bullshit with Combust just doing more damage. And once again, that's it, so...
Fire has been in an awkward place all expansion. It's the mage spec that needs to play the most aggressive, but just can't because of its limited defensives. It lacks the mobility of Arcane while having less snares and roots compared to Frost. It's definitely the weird stepchild of mage specs at this point. We predict that Frost will still be the best mage spec in Arena, especially since it's getting a pretty big quality of life improvement. Ice Lances with Fingers of Frost will no longer consume Winter's Chill, which means that Frost mages will have more consistent instant cast sustained damage. With that said, we still expect the current Frostbolt build.
Frost Mage has the... But here's one thing about Frost. Frost basically won't use tier, I think. The Frost Mage tier is trash. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what to make of Frost just yet. Because the set bonus is actually... You're not going to use it. It's really bad. Yo, Ace Carnage, thanks for the prime, dude.
To remain meta, and Frost Mages will continue to be the classic melee bully. Across the board, mages are also getting some PvP talent reworks, including the addition of Overpowered Barrier, which doubles the absorption of every shield and adds bonus effects whenever they break, with the drawback...
Yo, Alex Murphy, thanks for the sub, dude. I really appreciate that. Seriously, guys, thanks for the support today. Thanks, Ace Carnage.
Being that shields will now last for a short duration. Ring of Fire is also getting a rework, and will essentially be useless. Not only will it entirely replace Ring of Frost, but its damage is nerfed dramatically, with the only benefit being that it will disorient targets who walk through it, which then means Dragon's Breath or any fear effect is now on DR. Now let's move on to monks, starting with Mistweaver, who is getting another round of Whiplash this expansion. Let's explain. For those of you who have been out of the loop, monks have had a wild journey over the past few years. They've gone from being traditional healer to a melee healer, aka a Fistweaver, then briefly back to being a traditional healer, but with lightning, and then some weird hybrid spec, which they currently play now, merging the traditional healer role with a pseudo melee spec. 11.1 includes a bunch of mixed buffs to various parts of the Mistweaver kit, but most notably includes a huge change to Crackling Jade Lightning. To make things even better, Mistweaver monks will also be getting a new PvP...
Dude, this is so weird that you can run while casting. You may now cast while moving during lighter than air.
Talent that will allow them to temporarily cast while moving once again. Altogether, it's possible Mistweaver monks might be abandoning their hybrid melee playstyle to go back to a more classic healer role, since Jade Empowerment will now deal significantly more single target damage. If you see a monk channeling this in Arena, buckle up because you're about to take a lot of damage, which will be converted into healing for their team. Windwalker will probably see less dramatic playstyle changes overall, but we'll be getting an entirely new...
You think that talent won't be used, but I could be wrong. Overall, looks like a cool design / kit. Yeah, I think monks are going to bang, dude. Monk is already my favorite healer, by far.
Ability. Slicing Winds, which you may recognize from...
I think people will use it, too, Sea-Doo. Because you're going to be able to crackle around pillars. Like, if Crackling Jade Lightning ends up being, like, a huge hit of damage... getting microed on your crackle is actually terrible. You're going to be able to like channel it like arcane missiles now. So if you like roll have lighter than air and you do a big crackle, that's going to kill them and also top your whole team. You can channel it around pillars and stuff, which I think is going to be really big.
Plunderstorm is making its way to World of Warcraft, which sounds exciting until you realize it replaces Flying Serpent Kick. Right now, the identity of Windwalker Monk is kind of weird. These days, Windwalker is more of a brawler melee, but has been severely held back by mobility. Yes, that's right, what was once one of the most mobile melee in the game feels like a snail in the War Within. Will Slicing Winds fix this issue? Probably not. Monk will still be one of those melee that
I'm not sure how I feel about Windwalker Monk, to be honest with you. The Slicing Winds thing, I think, is cool, and it reminds me a little bit of like the Chi Torpedo from WoD. So the WoD Chi Torpedo, where you'd use basically your mobility for damage. That's kind of what this new Slicing Winds feels like. Like, I feel like 9 times out of 10, you're just gonna Slicing Winds from point blank. Like 1 second channel it, point blank Slicing Winds for 1,000,000 damage.
Where it has uptime, but without solid lockdown, it will continue to struggle in caster-heavy lobbies. Moving on, we have our 2 Paladin specs who had a very solid Season 1. Without a doubt, Holy was the MVP healer for the second half of the season, and had even
I'm not sure,
to melee wings playstyle.
Maybe it won't get used that much. I feel like it might have a playstyle.
The spec was interesting, as it literally involved chucking a sword at teammates while having a built-in.
Did you watch the Polymorph video with metaphors going off? No, I didn't, but I will after this.
Spirit Link totem mechanic. Needless to say, it was pretty strong. 11.1 is shifting around the healing profile of Holy Paladins, taking some healing away from Flash of Light to buff Holy Shock and Holy Light of all things, and the patch notes also include some key Lightsmith nerfs, specifically to Tempered in Battle.
I'm not gonna lie, Tempered in Battle staying the way it did for the whole season is one of the most wild things I think I've experienced in the history of WoW. Like, that's got to be up there and like one of the dumbest mechanics. And yeah, I'm pretty sure you don't even use Flash of Light right now, so that's hilarious.
It's likely that Holy Paladins will return to their more traditional Herald of the Sun playstyle, which centers around extending Tyr's deliverance and standing 40 yards away from teamfights. But what might hurt Paladin more than anything else is the removal of the Blessed Hands talent, which means no more double bop or double freedom. To compensate, Holy Paladins seem to be getting...
Dude, Paladins getting Blessing of Spell Warding is nuts. It's nuts, nuts, nuts. The servers are up. I'll get on the servers soon, guys. I want to finish this video. Something snarky. Thank you for the Prime Brew. Appreciate it. Blessing of Spell Warding is wild for Paladins, by the way.
Spell Bop, which was previously Ret and Prot exclusive. It's hard to say exactly how strong Paladins will be now that they've lost some of their utility, but we still expect them to be strong in the Season 2 meta. Ret is seeing far fewer changes in 11.1, but will be seeing the departure of one of its most iconic PvP talents. The next patch will say goodbye to Aura of Reckoning, which was the auto-proc wings that Paladins would randomly get throughout Arena. This is an interesting change because these days Ret Paladins don't even press Wings or Crusade at all, since Wake of Ashes does it automatically. In any case, there will be less Wings procs to worry about next season. Okay. Other than that, Ret isn't seeing many changes. It ended Season 1 with a bang, as many Paladins swapped over to Templar, whose signature Hammer of Light ability could do 3 million damage or more. What do we think about Season 2? Well, one-shots are still on the menu.
Yay.
Now let's move on to Priest, where there are some pretty big changes coming to both of the healer specs. Discipline is getting some massive changes to...
Dude, no Rapture. I'm not gonna lie, when I play Priest, Rapture is like my favorite button. Rapture is literally my favorite button. Using it in the opener to negate the opener and like playing modifiers around that. And then when Rapture comes back up, it's the only time I feel like, I feel real good right now. Like, so I'm very interested to see what happens when they get rid of that.
To its healing toolkit, and is even seeing the complete removal of Rapture and Purge the Wicked. But before you freak out, this isn't as bad as it sounds. First of all, a freshly reworked Evangelism is now taking the place of Rapture, and now does a...
Extends Atonement on all allies and heals split evenly amongst them. Okay, and that also gives you Archangel. They're combining those two.
Massive AoE heal when pressed, and will even leave targets with a juicy healing modifier when playing with the Archangel PvP talent, which has also been reworked. The patch is also doing a bit of remodeling to Penance, which if you play Disc now, you know has about 500 different modifiers. Blizzard is aiming to simplify things a bit by taking power away from these modifiers and putting them into Penance itself. What this simply means is that Disc will be much easier to play and will continue to shine as the healer that plays like a turret defense game, standing at a pillar and blasting anyone in sight. Holy is also seeing a bit of maintenance to its talent tree.
Yeah, maybe it'll be good.
And we know this looks like a lot of notes, but don't worry. The playstyle of the spec will largely remain the same. And if anything, expect to see more healing coming out of, well, heal, as in the actual spell. With that said, it's important to remember that the strength of Holy Priest entirely depends on the balance between healing and damage. At the end of the day, it is strictly a throughput-based healer. As long as it can do the majority of its healing with Serenity and Palm, it's totally...
Did you know it's the most fun version of Holy Priest I ever played, as a side note? When I first played Holy Priest in Legion, it was the most fun thing I've ever played in my life. It was insane.
Fine, but things really start to spiral when Holy is forced
It was
to hard
so
cast.
fun.
Shadow is one of the specs fundamentally changing the least in 11.1, seeing virtually zero changes.
Oh my god. Dude, that's all Shadow gets? That's all the patch notes for Shadow Priest? Jesus.
Changing the least in 11.1, seeing virtually zero changes outside some damage buffs. Currently, Shadow Priest is in a really good spot and might be one of the best design specs in PvP. It's definitely one of the tankiest casters in the game and is one that scales exceptionally well with player skill. Shadow Priests have so many responsibilities in Arena thanks to their utility and damage profile, and you really need to be mechanically proficient to excel at this spec. SP has retained its design as the tempo-based caster. If you can snowball your pressure, you're always going to be ahead. Now, to give you something to look forward to in the new season, Shadow has one of the best tier sets in the game, with Void Eruption and Dark Ascension automatically granting a few seconds of power infusion, allowing you a stronger burst window on demand. Now, out of all the classes in the game, Rogue is seeing the fewest changes by far, and we're sorry to tell all of you Rogue mains out there that almost every spec is getting slightly worse. Before we get into the good news and the bad news for you Peekaboo fans, let's quickly recap the state.
F's in the chat for Peekaboo. I don't think we're going to be seeing much of him this season. I really do hope that we can see Peekaboo, but I'm just not sure. One of the goats, man. One of the retail goats. One of my favorite streamers to watch. I hope he returns, but we'll see.
State of Rogue in 2025. Assassination ended season 1 as one of the...
He said he's in a better place. He's gone to a better place.
best melee in the game. What it lacks in control, it easily makes up for in damage thanks to having incredible multi-target throughput. Asa gains huge momentum with every opener and vanish, spreading massive AoE Garrets across the entire enemy team. Outlaw ended Season 1 as the premier rogue spec in 3v3 thanks to its tankiness. At its core, Outlaw is designed around cooldown reduction, resetting CDs by spending combo points and getting huge momentum during subterfuge with the right procs. It's easily one of the highest APM specs in all of WoW and is generally a staple in tournament play. Subtlety was widely regarded as the worst rogue spec at the end of the season, but always has amazing carry potential in the right situation. These days, Sub has a balance of sustained damage and burst thanks to some pretty decent DPS coming out of Rupture. Right now, Sub isn't bad, it's just a bit clunkier to play, and will be losing a niche cooldown this patch, but more on that later. Alright, now the good news.
Actually losing 2 big cooldowns. Rogues, I'm going to spoil this, Rogues are losing 2 big cooldowns. First one you're losing is Shadowy Duel. The second one is the Physical Cloak, which, in my opinion, I'm not going to lie, the Physical Cloak should have never been in the game to begin with. I think that was one of the most bizarre things that's ever been added. Cloak of Shadows being a physical removal was insane.
Every rogue spec will now have a new defensive PvP talent called Preemptive Maneuver, which makes the damage reduction portion of Feint insanely broken while in stuns, assuming you're playing with elusiveness. This of course means you might not be able to play Cheat Death anymore, which is bad news by some definition, but the worst news is the PvP talents you are losing. But before we get into it, we should note that there were last-minute damage buffs to every rogue spec just a few days before the patch. Alright, and now for the really bad news for you Pika fans. The controversial Physical Cloak PvP talent has been completely removed from the game, which will make your life a bit more stressful against virtually every other melee in the game. Outlaw is seeing a 1-2 punch with both Enduring Brawler and Take Your Cut both being removed from the game. These were both spec-defining PvP talents, and enabled the rogue caster synergy that dominated 3v3 this season. And finally, Sub is seeing the complete removal of Shadowy Duel. This was easily one of the most controversial abilities of all time in PvP, and this change will impact every part of the game.
By the way, Preemptive Maneuver, the talent that they're getting is actually wildly good. Like, Feint lasts longer, and if you pre-feint a stun, you take, what, half damage? Like, there's plenty of times where rogues are going to be able to, you know, feint a stun. It's going to happen often. Feint doesn't have that long of a cooldown. Like, it's going to be really, really, really good.
The game, from 2v2 all the way to BG Blitz. Every Shaman spec is also seeing some pretty dramatic changes. Despite the fact that Elemental is getting very few patch notes overall, the spec is fundamentally changing thanks to a rework to Primordial Wave, which could have a lasting impact. The current design of Prim Wave causes Lava Burst to automatically AoE. This is important because it feeds the Ellie Shaman a bunch of Maelstrom, which it can then spend on a bunch of Earth Shocks. In 11.1, Primordial Wave simply just deals damage to every target with Flame Shock, and is no longer even considered a Flame Shock dot itself. This means Ellie Shamans will be losing a bunch of AoE damage and all the downstream effects. Overall, this is a negative change for the spec, but it will be picking up a bit more utility thanks to a healing stream totem buff. But this is a drop in the bucket compared to what was lost. Blizzard is also continuing to add lightning bolt and chain lightning buffs to the spec, which it's done in the past, but is something that repeatedly fails over and over. For Ellie to be good, it needs those juicy meatballs. Enhancement Shaman, on the other hand, is getting a massive list of changes, with Blizzard explicitly stating that they want to shift its damage profile from spenders into builders. Now, in
Sick cutscene. We're gonna watch it, guys. I know the servers are up. We're just finishing up this video.
case you don't know anything about Enhance, the spec has two builds that it swaps between every season in recent years. One build focuses primarily on Lava Lash. This is the high APM and rotationally bloated version of Enhance, since it means sequencing through a bunch of attacks in a very precise order. Then there is the Storm Strike version of Enhance, which requires nothing more than a Donkey Kong bongo controller in order to play. Next season's tier set seems to be based around this build, which means that Enhance could wind up being significantly easier to play in the new patch. Enhance ended Season 1 as a high-tier melee, and given all the damage buffs it's getting, it's super likely that it will remain one of the best melee DPS going into Season 2. That brings us to Restoration Shaman, which, as we've already mentioned, has already taken the backseat to Evoker so far
I'm
this
pressed
year.
at Sea
11.1 introduces a few changes to Restoration Shaman, but most notably includes the complete removal of Primordial Wave, which will redefine burst healing for the spec in the foreseeable future. What's interesting, though, is that Resto is picking up a brand new talent.
I didn't even play the spec. So I got 2400 on my Shaman, which, I mean, whatever, 2400, you know, no big deal. But I wasn't even playing Primwave. So I was already not playing that talent.
Called Therazan's Resilience, which causes Earth Shield to not lose charges. Unfortunately, this shares a talent slot with Reactive Warding, which has been a key part of healing so far this expansion. Mana Tide is now baked directly into Healing Tide, which seems like a good thing on paper because it means less button bloat, but this could also backfire, since these days players snipe down totems like it's a Wild West shootout. Overall, it's really hard to predict how the spec will feel next season. It's pretty clear that many of these changes were made without PvP in mind. Blizzard's goal is to simplify the spec, but it's done so
Played Primwave with Totemic. I loved it. Well, it's gone now, Foxy. I'm sorry, bro.
in a way that makes Shaman a bit worse in PvP. And as we've already mentioned, Resto Shamans have already lost their title as the #1 aggressive healer. These days, Evokers just fill the role even better. Now let's move on to Warlocks, who is another class seeing very few changes overall. If you haven't played much this expansion, what you need to know first is that Affliction has been the best Warlock.
Oh my god, Affliction is so broken. This is my prediction. Affliction Warlock, because of its tier set, is going to be the most broken spec in the game. That's my prediction. The Affliction Warlock tier set is actually completely overpowered.
Spec in Season 1 and is completely different compared to the past. Gone are the days of tab targeting to spread UA. Affliction is now a single target burst spec in some ways, with Haunt doing ridiculous damage during cooldown windows. With that said, Affliction will be getting one of the best tier sets in Season 2, which will automatically spread UA to multiple targets.
Listen to this. Here, okay, where's the 2 set? Your spells and abilities have a chance to hit a jackpot, increasing your haste by 12%. And casting Dark Lair always gives you a jackpot. The 4 set is hitting a jackpot. Okay, so basically your spells and abilities give you haste, and it increases the damage of your UA by 50% and causes UA to spread to 3 targets. What the fuck, bro? You're gonna have giga juiced up triple UAs.
While also buffing its damage. That's right, priests, you might want to hold off on that Mass Dispel key. If there was one spec to win the most improved award of Season 1, it was definitely Demonology Warlock, who has seen multiple quality of life improvements over the past few months. You should already know that Demo is the classic nameplate simulator, summoning imps, dogs, and slightly bigger dogs to overwhelm the opponent's screen. In the past, Tyrant was a fundamental part of Demo damage. It was one of the scariest cooldowns in the game, but had one big drawback: the fact that it would occasionally stub its toe and forget that it even exists. These days, damage has been shifted away from Tyrant, whose main role now is to conduct the orchestra of demons on screen.
I like Demon.
Overall, Demo is one of the better specs in the game, but it still requires a bit more hard casting than everyone else. Out of all 3 Warlock specs, Destro is seeing potentially the biggest changes, with Dimensional Rift now being a passive proc with an optional talent.
Whoa.
Destro has been the weakest Warlock spec for a few months now. It's definitely the easiest mechanically since virtually all of its damage is instant cast, but it suffered the classic problem of not having finishing power in Arena. More often than not, it spends the game hopping around the arena, cycling through its 3 instant cast buttons, hoping that someone will eventually die. Now, there is one reason to be optimistic, as Bonds of Fel is getting a pretty significant buff. This is a key spell not only—
I actually really like Bonds of Fel. I always thought it was a cool talent. Yeah, I really like Bonds of Fel. There's so many like interesting PvP talents to me that just suck because they're undertuned, but Bonds of Fel I always thought was like a really, really cool ability. So I'm glad it's getting buffed.
Only for damage, but also managing interrupts. Warlocks are also getting a completely new Health Stone PvP talent, turning it from a heal into a mini Bloodlust. It's hard to say if this will see much play outside of very specific matchups, since Health Stone is such an important team-wide defensive cooldown. Unfortunately, these new talents are coming with the removal of Call Observer, which will no longer be a PvP talent for any Warlock spec. That finally brings us to Warrior. Overall, the class had a very strong Season 1.
Let's go Warriors! Dude, Warriors... I think Warriors have the potential to be really broken.
Even though Arms was lagging slightly behind. Not to worry, because the spec is seeing some pretty massive damage buffs across the board, with its hat-trick combo of Mortal Strike, Overpower, and Execute all getting damage increases.
Yeah, buddy!
With that said, Blizzard is aiming to simplify the rotation slightly by shifting the Mortal Strike damage buff from Overpower directly into MS itself. This is sticking on the theme of this expansion to make rotations feel a bit more fluid. Adding to this is the fact that Sharpened Blade
Wait, would you have gotten it, Fax, if you just stopped playing?
is now a passive proc based into Colossus Smash and Warbreaker, which means you'll now have one free keybind. The wildcard, as always, is simply uptime and numbers. If Arms is doing more damage than Fury, then it will be the de facto spec, simple as that. And speaking of which, Fury Warrior is getting some pretty hefty damage buffs too, and even a rework to Reckless Abandon, a talent that hasn't seen much play this season. If you've been gone for a while, Fury is one of the lucky specs to have two viable hero trees in PvP, with both Slayer and Mountain Thane each performing a unique role. Slayer is overall better for mobility and can even do some pretty nasty burst with Bladestorm. Mountain Thane, on the other hand, was a bit slept on early into the expansion, but actually has a defined role now as a solid option into melee cleaves, as the entire tree centers around Thunderclap and doing big AoE damage. No matter what happens next season, you can count on Fury being the high APM spec. It plays the brawler role better than anyone else. If given enough uptime, Fury will beat the pants off of any opponent. Warriors are also getting two new PvP talents across the board.
Yeah, this one is wild. Look at this. Berserker Roar. This is insane. Go Berserk. So you remove Fear, Sap, and Incapacitates. You also grant immunity to them, okay? So immune to Fear, immune to Sap, immune to Incapacitates for 6 seconds. And it also is like a War Banner now. So it reduces the duration of your next crowd control on your teammates by 50% for the next 10 seconds. It's super good.
The first is Berserker Roar, which basically replaces War Banner, baking its effect directly into Berserker Shout. Warriors will also be getting a new Dragon Charge that replaces Heroic Leap, charging forward a massive distance and knocking away anyone in its path. Overall, we expect Warrior to continue to strike a balance between being highly accessible while still feeling rewarding. Alright, so what do we think about the future of PvP? Well, it seems like the 11.1 class changes feel more like a new expansion release than a typical patch.
Yo, Midbrain, thanks for the prom, dude.
Massively behind on development these days, probably because they're releasing like 10 different versions of the game every year. Anyway, their class design philosophy seems to be making classes feel easier to play, which is why they've merged some spells together or made entire abilities passive in order to cut down on button bloat. Even though the start of the season might be a bit chaotic, we expect most specs to slowly gravitate towards the A tier as the expansion progresses.
Yep.
We're going to warn you, though, that there is still a lot of information to track, and game knowledge continues to create a growing gap between players.
Oh my god, I'm sensing a rating gain guarantee.
That's why our courses are so insanely OP for gaining rating, because they close this gap by teaching you the fundamentals you need to actually reach your potential. Whether it's positioning, role-specific tips, or guides on how to counter every class, we've got you covered. And now, Skill Cap members get full access to the #1 UI in PvP.
I will say, like, this is a shameless Skill Cap plug. The Skill Cap UI, if you guys don't know what to do with your UI, it is really OP. I know people that, like, the UI in WoW is one of the most inapproachable things, and what Skill Cap did actually is super smart.
PvP built from the ground up to make sure you have a unique advantage over your
I don't use it,
no
but...
No matter what, we will back you up with a rating gain guarantee, where we promise that you will see...
Cool video, yeah. QL. All right, there it is, boys. The servers are up too. It's time to queue.